The highway stretched endlessly before him. Each mile felt like 10. The drone of the engine was overtaken by the growling in his stomach. John was starving. He had been driving for hours, since well before the sun dipped below the horizon. The faint glow of his headlights illuminated the desolate road. He longed for a break, a place to rest. Suddenly, a neon sign pierced the darkness. Haven's Diner, open 24 hours. A wave of relief washed over John. The warm, inviting glow seemed to promise solace, a refuge from the unending darkness. Ignoring a prickle of unease at the back of his neck, he turned onto the gravel driveway. He pulled up towards the diner, its bright exterior a stark contrast to the desolate landscape surrounding it. John stepped out of his car, the silence of the night hitting him like a physical force. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost expectant. He could hear the sound of his own breath, amplified in the stillness. He turned back to look at his car. It seemed out of place, a splash of modernity against the backdrop of the old, weathered diner. John pushed open the diner door. The warmth inside enveloped him like a comforting hug. It was a stark contrast to the crisp night air. The diner was smaller than he imagined. A long counter ran the length of the room. Red vinyl stools lined the counter, each one polished to a high shine. A jukebox in the corner hummed a forgotten tune, a melancholic melody that seemed to drift from another era. Behind the counter, a woman stood polishing glasses. Her smile was wide, unwavering, and sent a chill down John's spine. "Welcome to Haven's Diner, hun. What can I get for you?" He hadn't noticed her before. She seemed to materialize from the shadows, her movements fluid and silent. "Just coffee, please," John mumbled, taking a seat at the counter. He felt her eyes on him, watching his every move. The coffee was surprisingly good. Rich, flavorful, and steaming hot. It warmed him from the inside out. He looked around, taking in the diner more closely. Everything was meticulously clean, spotless even. There was an unsettling stillness to the place. The jukebox continued its mournful tune, the only sound other than the gentle clinking of John's spoon against his coffee cup. He glanced at his watch, but the second hand wasn't moving. It was as if time itself had stopped the moment he stepped inside Haven's Diner. "Is something wrong, hun?" the waitress asked. Her voice was like honey, smooth and sweet, but with a sharp edge. John jumped. He hadn't heard her approach. "No, nothing," he said, forcing a smile, just admiring the place. He needed to leave. Now! The silence was deafening. The air felt thick, heavy. John stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Check. Please," he said, his voice a strained whisper. The waitress didn't move. She just stood there, her smile unwavering. "You don't want to leave, hun," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is your haven now." John stumbled back, fear gripping him like a vice. He threw open the diner door and ran. He drove through the night, desperate to escape the memory of Haven's Diner. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her smile, heard the eerie silence, felt the crushing weight of that place. He was trapped, forever tethered to Haven's Diner. If you ever find yourself on that desolate highway, keep driving. Don't let the warm glow and the promise of comfort lure you in. Haven's Diner offers no haven, only eternal captivity. John thought he had escaped. The road stretched endlessly before him, a dark ribbon under the moonlight. But the farther he drove, the more he felt an insidious presence creeping into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, followed. Gap 2S. The radio crackled to life. Static filled the car, then a voice soft and familiar. "Welcome back, John." It was the waitress. Her voice was a ghostly whisper, echoing through the car's speakers. John's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He glanced at the rearview mirror and saw nothing but darkness. Gap 2S. Desperate for answers, John pulled into a small, rundown motel. The neon sign flickered, casting eerie shadows. As he checked in, the receptionist handed him an old tarnished key. "Room 7, she said, not meeting his eyes. John nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. Gap 2S. In the room, John found an old photograph on the nightstand. It was of Haven's Diner, dated 1953. The waitress was there, unchanged, standing next to a man who looked eerily like John. His heart raced as he realized he was staring at a ghost from the past. He turned the photo over and saw a message scrawled in faded ink. "You can never leave. Gap 2S." Suddenly, the room grew cold, the lights flickered, and shadows danced on the walls. John heard whispers, indistinct and haunting. He backed into a corner, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The door creaked open, and the waitress stood there, her smile as chilling as ever. "Welcome home, John," she said, stepping forward. "Gap 2S." John's scream echoed through the night, swallowed by the darkness. If you ever find yourself on that desolate highway, remember, some roads lead to places that time forgot, and some doors once opened can never be closed. Gap 2S, Haven's Diner is always waiting. John's scream had barely faded when he found himself standing in the middle of Haven's Diner. The air was thick with the scent of old coffee and something far more sinister. The diner was empty save for the flickering lights casting long, ghostly shadows. Gap 2S. He blinked, disoriented, trying to remember how he got there. The waitress was gone, but her presence lingered, a palpable tension in the air. The jukebox in the corner crackled to life, playing an old, haunting tune that sent shivers down his spine. Gap 2S. John walked to the counter, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He saw the same photograph from the motel, now framed and hanging on the wall. Next to it was another picture, this one dated 1923, showing the same waitress, unchanged, standing behind the counter of a much older version of the diner. Gap 2S. The door to the kitchen swung open, revealing a dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch into infinity. Against his better judgment, John walked toward it, driven by an inexplicable need to uncover the truth. The walls were lined with more photographs, each one showing the waitress with different patrons, all of whom bore an uncanny resemblance to John. Gap 2S. He reached the end of the hallway where a heavy wooden door stood ajar. Pushing it open, he found himself in a small candlelit room. At the center was a table with an old ledger, its pages yellowed with age. John flipped through it, finding names and dates, each entry accompanied by a photograph of the diner and its ever-present waitress. Gap 2S. A sudden noise made him spin around. The waitress stood in the doorway, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You wanted answers, John," she said, her voice echoing through the room. "This place is a nexus, a point where time and reality blur. Those who enter are bound to it forever." Gap 2S. John backed away, his mind racing. "But why me? What do you want from me?" he demanded. The waitress stepped closer, her smile widening. "You were chosen, John, just like those before you. Haven's Diner needs a keeper, someone to ensure its secrets remain hidden. And now that someone is you?" Gap 2S. The room began to spin, the walls closing in. John's vision blurred, and he felt himself being pulled into the darkness. The last thing he heard was the waitress's chilling laughter echoing in his mind. Gap 2S. When he opened his eyes, he was back behind the counter, wearing the same uniform as the waitress. The diner was full of patrons, all of them familiar, all of them trapped. And John knew with a sinking feeling that he was now part of Haven's Diner forever. Gap 2S. Remember, if you ever find yourself on that desolate highway, beware of Haven's Diner. Some places hold secrets that can never be uncovered, and once you enter,